What is up guys, Stu here, and welcome back to another new review. I'm sweating buckets because it's incredibly hot out in London today, so bear with me if it suddenly looks like I've been drenched with a bucket of water. It is just my sweat. And there's a lovely image to start this review off. So this week we are talking about a new film that's just come out over here in the UK. It's been out a while in the States where it got a lot of buzz. That film is Hereditary. And I was incredibly excited for this one for many different reasons. Mainly just because it's from A24, who are a production company who, you know if you watched any of my videos before, everything they seem to put out seems to be gold. And even when it's not gold, it's still like a slightly shinier metal than other stuff that gets put out. It got a lot of buzz, this one, from film festivals when it was shown earlier in the year. A lot of people saying this is like the scariest film ever. So it's one of those films where you get screenings and people are like, people had to walk out of the screen. Oh, people were changed for life after this film. People lost their legs to this film. Not quite that extreme, but might as well, honestly. And so with films like that, it's very easy to get sucked into this whole kind of overhyping, in particular with horror films. I do not envy people that have to market horror films, so A24, you're doing good, hold strong. But there's a lot of talent involved in this one. A lot of my friends over in the States that have seen it saying, yeah, it is really, really quite something you're going to check out. So I was very excited for it. Went along and saw it last week. I am going to add my name to the long list of people who are shouting their praises for Hereditary. I really, really did adore this film. I'll try and keep this spoiler free, but there are going to be things I just have to go into spoilers on to discuss certain points. So I'll put a little notice on the screen there. So if you want to go in completely blind, switch this video off. I won't take offense. Unless you don't come back, please come back. So in that respect, keeping this as spoiler-free as I can really at this point, the film is essentially just about a family who is dealing with a relative passing away. Gonna keep that nice and vague. Imagine if it was just that. It'd be very depressing. And it's directed by first-time feature film director Ari Aster. I think it's Ari, it could be Ari, but I'm going to go with Ari, even though it does make me sound like a Cockney chimney sweep. And honestly, I'm quite impressed at this guy's direction here. I've not seen any of his shorts he's done before this, but for a first feature film here, I mean, the dude smashed it. I mean, direction-wise, it's an incredibly interesting take on a lot of things we've seen before in the horror genre. I mean, it deals with a lot of familiar, I guess, I don't want to call them cliches because I don't really agree with a lot of people that say that there are lots of cliche things in this film. But it does deal with a lot of tropes that we've seen done in other films, just done differently here. And that's something that I always look for in new horror films from new directors, looking for ways that they're doing new interesting things. It's one of the things that draws me so much to the films of James Wan, who's a horror director I love. I mean, his films are, for a lot of people, quite over the top and ridiculous, but for me, James Wan as a director always does something different with his scares and always finds new ways to scare us as an audience, and that's what excites me about a lot of modern horror, and that's what excited me so much about Hereditary. It's filled with very clever and interesting ways to scare us, and they're not all just kind of, look how fucking scary this is. The best thing about this film from a kind of horror aspect for me is that it's more of one of those films which makes you feel incredibly unsettled and has a very constant feel of dread throughout. There are certain sequences in this film which you just can't look away from, but you at the same time really want to look away from because it's fucked. It's very fucked. There's a lot of genuinely fucked up stuff that happens in this film. I mean, stuff that's probably going to stick with me for life. And that is a good sign of a good horror film, I think. I mean, Toni Collette is fantastic in this film. She plays the mum in the family. And you're going to hear a lot of stuff about her performance, and it is phenomenal. But there are some seriously fucked up things that Toni Collette does in this film, which are quite hard to remove from the mind after seeing it. I think you'll know what I'm talking about if you've seen the film. She plays this very, very interesting line of coming off as a little bit batshit crazy, but also a incredibly tormented individual going through copious amounts of grief in her life. She plays all those emotions very well, and it's that sort of emotion from a character throughout this film which creates an unsettling environment, because it means that there are things that are happening in this film, scenes that aren't really horror scenes. You know, there's bits of dialogue, bits of character conversation, and the way that Toni Collette and the other people in the cast play these roles means that there's something off about every scene in this film, and it's that kind of sense of unease which really works for me here. And I've seen a lot of people say that is present throughout the film, but then as the film goes on, it starts to veer towards more cliche stuff, and it starts to become a little bit more kind of, oh, big bang crazy, this is like generic horror stuff versus the first half. And I've got to say, I really don't agree with that standpoint. I can see why that's the case for a lot of people. But for me, this film is a masterclass in showing how to kind of develop something throughout a film and gradually build to a batshit ending. And this is where I'm going to get into some spoilers, so I'm going to put a little thing up here. If you want to skip spoilers, just go ahead to this time code here. So, the end of this film, it's essentially revealed that there is a big kind of cult around the family that is, for whatever means, trying to get a demon called Payman into the body of the son of the family. That's what the whole film's about. And so I think what people have issue with here is that when that gets revealed and when the pieces start becoming a bit more clear in that, it gets a little bit more kind of cliche and generic, to use other people's terms on that one. I don't really agree with that. And the reason I don't really agree with that is that I think the first half is innately more kind of, I guess, mysterious and slow burning because you're not told really what's going on here, because you can't be. That's how films work. And then you get to the point when you're told, and I think it really comes down to how much you're on board with that concept. For me, I am terrified by the idea of cults. So just that as a general concept, as soon as you see that happen in a film, I was like, oh shit, it's that. That's what this is. I'm very scared now. But yeah, I actually think Ari Aster, in the direction and the writing of this film, does a very, very good job of knowing when to drop pieces of information for the audience. So it kind of slowly builds to an understanding of what's actually going on here. And I think that's where this film would benefit from a second viewing. I think a lot of people that feel like it gets more ridiculous until it's a bit more of a cliche ending would do well to check it out again. It's a horror film about a cult that's trying to get hold of this demon through this family. And when you know that from the beginning, having watched it a second time myself, you begin to appreciate a little bit more how well those story elements are woven in through the first half of this film. But that's also one of my other favourite things about the film, is that it will take sort of, I guess, call them cliches, but themes that we've seen in previous horror films, tropes that we've seen, like, for example, and this isn't really spoiling anything, but like seances and the idea of seances and conjuring spirits. It will take things like that and it will do a scene which, I guess, if you want to look at it one way, does look quite generic, but it's really the way that it chooses to position itself in its perspective that was different and unique to me. The way that it goes about those scenes is different in this film and is approached differently, and that was more scary to me than seeing like things moving around the room. Those things are present in this film, and I think if you hone in on that thing, that's where you're going to get this whole, oh, it's just cliche ghost stuff we've seen before. But I think it's the perspective it brings to that in a different way of doing it that Ari Aster taps into so well in this film that really steps it above the others. But overall, I have to commend how effectively Aster was able to conjure up this deeply unsettling, dread-filled atmosphere throughout this film. It's a sort of film where you just feel quite sick and not at ease through every scene in this film, even when the more obviously scary things aren't happening. And I love the fact that it's one of those films which kind of soaks itself and revels in the reactions of characters as opposed to what they're seeing. I mean, there are things in this film which are deeply unsettling from imagery-wise and what you're seeing. You know, people in the shadows, demons, whatever you want to call them, things in the shadows. But what scares me the most in horror films are people's reactions to those things in the shadows. And that's something that this film tapped into incredibly well for me. And is, again, why I love Toni Collette's performance. There are certain moments where you just see her react. Or if you see her son, played by Alex Wolff in the film, the way he reacts to certain things, it's those reactions which will stick with me and which did stick with me throughout the film, but also when I left the cinema, and which make me feel incredibly nervous. It's knowing when to show the audience what the character is seeing. And I think Ari Aster's completely nailed that in this film. It's a masterwork in in knowing when to drop information for audience members. And when you do get that information, it's fucking terrifying. I can say it is absolutely terrifying. I was shitting myself throughout this film, for lack of a better word. But it's not going to scare everyone. And so I think that's something important to remember before you go see this film. If you haven't seen it yet, and if you're looking at all those posters which are saying this is the new Exorcist for this generation, or this is the scariest film ever, you have to be very wary and cautious of marketing like that. They are trying to sell you a horror film, and no one knows what scares them better than themselves, right? It just so happens that the stuff that scares me is present throughout the entirety of this film. So yeah, I absolutely adore Hereditary. I think it's a fantastically executed, slow burn of a horror film which goes to batshit places and isn't afraid to stay there and sit in your mind and terrify you. I wholeheartedly recommend it if you're a fan of horror films, if you're a fan of films which aren't so much typically jumping at you, making loud noises scary, and a little bit more kind of things in the darkness that you haven't noticed until you do notice them scary. If that sounds like your thing, go check it out. I'm sure you're going to really enjoy it. I absolutely adored it, and I can't wait to see it again, to be honest. I will happily go see this for a third time. But what about you guys? Have you seen Hereditary? It's been out in the UK for about a week now. It's been out in the US a little while longer. By now, you've probably had a chance to go check it out. Let me know what you thought about it in the comments below, whether you were disappointed by it, whether you were, like me, very, very unsettled and terrified by it. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel for more reviews like this. And if you want to see some more in-depth thoughts on the film and other little bits of in-depth thoughts, go check out my podcast. It's a weekly podcast called the Stu Talks Podcast. I'll put a link to that in the description below. There's going to be a review of Hereditary and I believe Ocean's 8 in there as well this week, plus some other little bits. So if that sounds like something you want to do, go check it out. But until next time, I'm going to go cry in a room. But I'm going to make sure the lights are on because I can't be dealing with shadows anymore. Thank you. Thank you, Hereditary. Cheers. Stay beautiful, mother truckers.